Welcome back to HANA Basics for Developers. So we've largely completed our development of our project. Pretty much we started with nothing. We've created a new project. We've created the data model, the database intensive logic, views, stored procedures. We service enabled our data, added some imperative logic and other validations at that service level, and then have also built a user interface on top of it. So now we're ready to really kind of finish our development and package it for transport into a downstream system and talk a little bit more about the overall lifecycle management of the project once we're done making our changes or additions to a project. So let's talk about some of the mechanics first of packaging and preparing for transport, and then we'll come back and talk about some of the conceptual parts as well. So if we switch over to the Web IDE, let's say I'm now done with my project, as I am. I've tested it locally. I'm satisfied with my development so far. If I want to then prepare it, the project, I want to prepare it for transport into any other system, what I would do is I would come to the project level and I would right mouse click and I would choose build. Now, sometimes people do this by accident. They're wanting to build their database module so that it can, so you can test it. You know, we've done that a lot throughout the exercises and the videos here. But if you come up to the project level and you do a build at the project level, what you really do is prepare the entire project for transport. Now, I've done this in advance. As you can see here, it took about a little less than 3 minutes to do, and I didn't want to just be recording the whole time and then have to cut it out. Not terribly exciting. I mean, once you right mouse click and you choose build, basically it just pulls some entries out to the log, which we can see now after the fact anyway. What it does is it goes through each. It prepares a list of the modules by reading the MTA YAML, and it prepares each module individually, does a local build, does npm, pulls in all the necessary dependencies to each module. It's looking at the package JSON of each module, and then like for this one, it says, oh, some of this information is cached. It says, oh, that's already up to date. That's been built recently. That's okay. It comes over here, to some of the other modules, and you see, well, it does a rebuild of the CDS to make sure it has all the latest sources, that I haven't missed a build CDS, which I hadn't, but it does it again anyway. For our node modules, you can see that it's calling npm. Well, a little bit lower down here, we'll see it calling each of those, and then it builds an MTA archive. So the result of building at this level actually does not deploy anything into the database. So unlike building the database module that deployed into the database, this is just creating this archive, this zip file, and it puts it here in a separate folder called MTA archives. And inside here we see a subfolder for each project, and then we see our MTAR file or MTAR file, an MTA archive file. And what we can do here is we could download this. I'm going to download it to my local machine so we can have a look at what's actually inside here. So let's put here my folder where I've been keeping everything, and I'll just open it now. You can see that it is a regular zip file, that it can be opened by any zip utility. You also see, we didn't have a ton of development artifacts in our project. I mean, it was decently sized, but look at the size of this archive. It is 236 megabytes. Okay, that is pretty large, and I'll show you the reason why. Like if I go into my database module, look, 28 megabytes for the database module itself. And that isn't all of the things that we created. I mean, obviously we have a lot of source files, but if you were to go through here and you'd add up the size of all these source files, it's a bunch of text and XML files. They're relatively small. It certainly doesn't add up to 28 megabytes. The reason that it's so large is that it actually packs in all the related libraries, in this case node modules. So if we go into the node modules folder, we can see it's packed the deployer inside here, and all the JavaScript, Node.js code for the deployer. And if we go inside there, we see all the dependent modules are pulled in here as well. So this has two purposes. Okay, so first of all, by packaging all the related libraries and modules at deploy time, we've created a consistent deployer. We've taken all those libraries at the state that they're at the time that we did the build, so the state that we've tested, and we put them in the archive. So as I said, this is the deployer itself. So then when we move this to another system, even if that other system is on a different version of HANA, a different version of XSA, maybe time has passed, maybe it's been a couple weeks since we exported out of the development system, done patches since then, or it's an older version, we're going to get the same deploy experience regardless of differences in time and version, because we're sending the whole deployer along with it. So this provides better consistency, better, you just know what's going to happen when you get to the next system, because you've already tested with the same deployer here in this case. The other thing that this does is obviously to run npm here, we had to go and fetch, you see here a lot of open source libraries, and yes, we could get them from the Sinopia cache, as we talked about earlier in the video where we covered Node.js modules. But you can imagine some other projects that you're creating, maybe they do go out to the internet, maybe they do retrieve additional modules, maybe your downstream system, your production system, you don't want to allow that level of access to the internet, and that's fine. You only need to connect your development system to the internet, because we're going to retrieve all those modules at this build time, and we're going to pack them into this archive file as well. So not only do we get consistency, but we can have a production system where these same applications run fine, and they don't need to be able to access the internet. So we aren't going to run an npm. We're not going to need to download any additional files from the internet. Everything that we need to install this application is now self-contained within this archive. And as I said, it does make for a larger archive, but the benefits are obvious. The other thing is it included everything. So it doesn't just include like the changes. If I would go back into my project and I would change just one file and I would increment the version number, you can see our version number here was 001, but I would redo a build, it would create a new file with 002 on the end. It would be just as large as this file. It never exports only changes, only deltas. It exports the entire project, the state of the project, at the time that you do the build, and the delta, if you will, is actually calculated upon import. So when it gets to the QA system or the production system, it's going to analyze the target state and compare it against what's in the archive, and only redeploy the objects that have actually have a difference between the two. So while we export everything, that is actually more efficient than trying to track a bunch of changes, because as soon as you track individual changes and only export the changes, then you have to worry about the order that you import things in. It becomes much more important, and you can get, if you just get out of order, then you can get misdependencies, and it can become a real nightmare. But if we always export the whole thing, we're always going to get a consistent state. So you see, with all the changes that we've made with the HDI deployer, the container technology, we're really conscious of the customer feedback that they wanted. First and foremost, consistent state every time they import something into the production system. You know, that's why if we find any error, we roll back the entire container in the case of HDI. So, you know, this is just another part of that idea of consistency. If I back up here, looking at my archive, you know, we see our other modules. They're all pretty much the same. They all get zipped. They all get the supporting libraries pulled in here as well. So for our Node.js, we've got a lot of dependent modules going on there. So certainly that's probably actually where a lot of our size, 80 megabytes for our Node.js module, even our web module, 29 megabytes. It's pulling in, once again, node modules for the app router. Probably, every one of these is a pretty equal size there. The only other thing that we really see in here that's of kind of interest is the build process also takes our MTA YAML file and converts it to an MTAD YAML. This means the deployer version of the MTA information. And it does do some transformations on the format and content of the file. It can expand some things in place. You see it expanding in this case, the UAA in place here. I'm just showing you this so you're aware of it. This isn't really something that you have to mess around with, but just so you're aware that at deploy time there is a transformation that happens between your MTA. You can think of it just the MTA YAML as your design time, and then the deploy time is an altered state, perhaps with exploded information. You can see that if you come here into the archive. But in essence, we have this zip archive. It's ready to be transported. There's a couple different mechanical options on how we can transport it. First of all, I can just right mouse click and I can say deploy. Now if I choose deploy to XS Advanced, what it's going to give me is the options to deploy to another space on this same system. It cannot deploy to a foreign XSA instance. So in other words, I cannot transport from, say, development to QA to prod using this tool. I can only go into another space or even the same space on this system. And you might say, well, that's kind of odd. I'm already on the development system. Why do I want to deploy to the development system again? And actually, this brings up a really good point. Remember, when we deployed our database module, when we did our build and we deployed our database module, the container name is not what we specified. It's not just Open SAP HANA HDI container. It's actually my user ID, workshop 00 dash, and then this string here. It's a unique string to identify our workspace, and then our project name. And the same thing happens with our schemas. When we looked at the schema, so let me just select current schema from dummy. We didn't get the schema name that we specified. It will actually add some content to it to make it unique. So the intention is when you do a build from the web IDE, that isn't intended to be the permanent version of the content that other developers use while they're developing. And it's meant to be a private copy, a sandbox copy for just you. I mean, we talked about this earlier, that each developer can check out the same project and work in parallel, and they can build in parallel, and they don't overwrite each other. And actually, the same thing is true here of even the services. I let that sit too long, so now I get to log back in. But I want to drill in here, and I want to show you even the Node.js and Java services. Look, they get the same thing. They get a unique string added onto the front of them. That isn't that isn't what we want. Even the URL has a unique string in it. And this is so multiple developers can work in the same environment at the same time. So in order to get a stable version of the project that multiple developers can share. So if another developer was working in a separate project and they wanted to connect to our container, our DB container, we don't want them connecting to this version of the container that has our username and stuff in it. This is meant to be temporary. We want them connecting to the real version with the real names that are only created when you deploy the mtar file. So this means at the end of a development cycle, when I'm ready to move this, the first place I have to move it is right back into the development system so that we get a nice stable version of the MTA. And to that end, what we see here is individual developers can work in parallel, and they're all syncing their code via Git. And it might be at the end of one developer's work, they're not building the mtar file like I showed you in the web IDE. They're probably just pushing their code back to Git, so it can then be consolidated with multiple developers. And it's usually some sort of admin, the development manager. At SAP, we often call this the QA manager. This person is responsible for the work that all these different developers are doing, and they're responsible for doing the pull of the consolidated version that has all the individual changes, testing it locally in doing an integration test, if you will, but then they often are the ones that create the mtar, or they are the ones that trigger the process to create the mtar, and then they deploy it by the command line, as I'll show you here in a minute, or from the web IDE, and then you have this consistent version. And that's also if you're going to test in development with like external tools, with the BI tools, external interfaces, you don't want to be pointing to all these various container versions that could be at different states. You want a stable version that you can continue to point back to. Okay, so this also brings up the idea of we've got to utilize Git more than just as one version for the dev system, but instead start thinking about multiple branches inside of Git, for different projects that are going on. And this can get quite complex, but support the complex nature of your development. You might have multiple branches of development. You might have multiple feature branches where you're working on different projects with different timelines. You might have to make a hotfix directly to the code as it is in the state in production, but you don't go directly to the production system and make that change. You simply clone from the master branch, which should always match your state in production, make your hotfix in a hotfix branch, test it, and then merge that change back into the master branch, and also cherry pick it, pull it over into your development branch and merge it with all your outstanding feature branches. Now, I know this is a lot to talk about here, and I don't want to recover all the concepts of full transport management and continuous integration, as it's often called. But what I want to refer you to is actually a recording from TechEd 2018 of a session that I gave on, it's titled Continuous Integration for HANA Database Development, but really we cover continuous integration, Git branching strategy, container structure strategy, even if you want to use CTS Plus as part of your transport management. So we touch on all these concepts that go beyond just getting the MTA archive out, and this would really be the next step of your discussion here. I don't want to repeat everything that's already available in this video, because even if you didn't attend TechEd, it is free to view online, and I'll put a link to this in the show notes. But I would encourage you to, this is just the start of the discussion of packaging for transport. Really, the rest of the options after we get it packaged, I would refer you to this session as the next step in your learning. So going back to sort of the mechanical approach, knowing that maybe it's the developer doing this to deploy to the system, maybe it's an admin, maybe, as you'd see in that other TechEd video from DAT300, maybe it's an automated process that builds. You're not even going to the web IDE and building this archive. We have a command line builder that can be integrated into scripting, and we do this inside of SAP. We use Jenkins as our continuous integration build server, and we actually build from the command line there. And in this TechEd session, we also talk about a best practice guide where we publish some of these scripts and some of these open source tools, information about them that we use at SAP. But putting aside the larger thing, yes, you can transport into the same HANA system same XSA instance but a different space, or the same space using this tool. I will tell you though that I don't personally use this option very often. It's simple. You just click deploy and off it goes. Two problems with it. I can't pass in any command line parameters to control the deployment, and often I want to use the like set the namespace parameter at deploy time. That's a minor issue. The other issue is the logs that come back aren't really great. So if it errors out, you kind of just get deployment failed, and then you still have to go to the command line to see all the deployment details. I personally like to deploy from the command line using the XSA command line tool, and it's just the command XS deploy. You can do a help on the XS deploy command. You'll see the options. It's pretty simple, but what it means is exporting that mtar file down to my local machine and then locally issuing the XS deploy command. But once again, both these options are kind of one-off manual, and the DAT300 really talks more about how this works at scale in larger scale projects. So I don't want you to think that the command line or this interactive option is the only way to do it. Actually, large corporations that set up ongoing deployments in a you're either going to tie into CTS Plus or you're going to use a continuous integration approach to automate a lot of the mechanics of this. But it's important to understand what's going on here. I want to show you one other option that's rather interesting. If you saw when I did the deploy, there's actually an option to deploy to the SAP Cloud platform directly. And what you have to do here is, now it wants a Cloud Foundry API endpoint. Well, I would come over here to the SAP Cloud platform, and I would log into Cloud Foundry. Okay, and I've kept everything up too long here as well. I'm going to log back in. But I would log into Cloud Foundry because, we talked earlier, Cloud Foundry on the SAP Cloud platform is really the equivalent functionality to XSA on-premise. Same sort of cockpit, same sort of concepts here of orgs and spaces. I'm going to drill into my org, and this is going to give me the API endpoint for my particular organization. And I'll take that URL and I'll put it in here. And then it's going to go out and make a request. Now, the first time that you do this, it asks you for your credentials, your username and password, your email address and password for the SAP Cloud Platform. I did this once before I started the recording to make sure everything worked right, and of course it asked me then, and now my credentials are cached in the browser, so that's why it didn't ask me for it again. What it did is it retrieved my organizations and my spaces. I only have one org and only have one space. If I click deploy, I would sit here for a couple of minutes while it deploys. It's going to do the same thing that it would do if it deployed locally, except it's sending it out to the SAP Cloud Platform. Likewise, I could also do the deploy from the CF command line as well. But for many customers, they might like this approach to do their development locally, maybe using HANA Express on their own local machine, as I'm doing here, but then they run their application from that point forward in the SAP Cloud Platform. So we've tried to make it as easy as possible to do that scenario. Really, as I said, I wanted to cover the mechanics, and I guess the last part of the mechanics. I mean, of course, I would push this to Git. We haven't been connecting this up to a Git repository, not a public Git repository, but I would certainly do a push to get all my changes into Git, because the persistence of your project is not here in the web IDE. This is temporary persistence. Only Git has your permanent persistence. So I'd want to push this. I'd want to stage all my changes, give it a better description than what I just did there, and then I would push it to my remote branch, and then all my changes, all my version history are persisted inside of Git, of course. You can also, if you want, you can kind of do this old school and just do an export of the zip of your project from time to time. If you wanted to, I I say just connect it up to Git and use Git as your persistence. Then you get proper version management as well as good backup and recovery of your code and the whole concept of multiple branches and things like that. But in a pinch, there's always the export import. But I would say at the end of the process, I've committed to Git. My source code is persisted for other developers to see, maybe merged it into a branch, done all that good stuff that we talk about in DAT 300. I've created my archive. It's gotten transported. I need to do some cleanup here, okay? Because remember, my modules, my resources, they've created these temporary versions here. I don't want this stuff sticking around. It's taking up space. So if I'm really done developing on this project, well, I'd probably come here first and I would remove these entries from the Database Explorer because I just don't want them junking up my Database Explorer. So I just do a remove database. That doesn't physically remove the database. That's not deleting anything from the database. It's not deleting the container, the schema, nothing like that. It's simply removing it from your visibility here in the Database Explorer. I could still come here and I could add it back. See, it hasn't gotten rid of it. But we want to get rid of those containers. They were temporary. They were only for while I was working on this project. I'm now done with the project. So used to be we'd have to go to the command line or the admin tool and delete these. But now we have a nice feature here in the Web IDE. I can simply come here and click the trash can, and that will get rid of it. It's going to ask me, are you sure? Yes, I'm sure. So that's going to clean up the container instance there. And that's for my user DB. Let's get rid of the instance here for my other container. If I want to, I can get rid of the UI5 instance. And I could really get rid of any of these. I probably want to get rid of my user-provided service if I really didn't need it anymore. Although that can be shared by multiple projects. We created that outside of the Web IDE. You notice it doesn't have the username and namespace on the service instance. So maybe I leave that around. Maybe I clean it up. I certainly can clean it up from here if I want to. I can delete it from here. Maybe I'll leave that for now in case at a later time I check out the project again. I don't want to have to do the manual recreation of those objects. It'll just reconnect those. But my other resources are gone. If I come back to the Database Explorer, you'll see that those container instances are gone. The schema's gone. The data any data that I loaded into those schemas gone. So it's done a complete cleanup in the database. And the final thing that I'd want to do is I'd want to come here to my run panel, and I have my 3 services. I want to click the red stop, and this red stop does more than just really does more than just stop the application. It's actually going to delete the instance of the module from the XSA layer. So what you see here is now the web module is gone. I only have XSJS and my service module. But if I stop those now as well, I'll go ahead and stop the service, stop the XSJS. They are both stopped. And if I refresh, there we are. They're gone from here as well. So because they were private for my user, if I delete the project and I don't clean that stuff up, it gets orphaned. It would have to be manually cleaned up from the admin tools. You don't want to leave a bunch of instances out there. It's taking up resources. So if you're going to delete the project, go clean up this stuff first. And now at this point, with it pushed to Git, I could come here and delete the project. There's no reason to keep a project that I'm not going to work on anymore in my Web IDE. At any time, I could go get it from Git anyway. And if I was going to leave it for a couple days and then come back and work on it again, I'd still want to re-pull it from Git to get any changes that maybe someone else has pushed into my development branch. So it's the kind of thing that, don't think of what's in the Web IDE as permanent. Don't load it up with tons of projects. It should be just the ones you're working on. Your real permanent persistence, the real life cycle of the design time objects is in Git. Now I've got a clean system again. I've been a good developer. I've cleaned up after myself. I've gotten rid of the container instances and the service instances. I'm ready to go work on a different project now. And I will say, just as one last point, we're trying to improve this process, the service panel, making it easy to delete the services that are created during provisioning. Another thing that we're talking about doing down the road is when you delete the project, if you have any of this stuff, maybe just pop up a dialog and say, would you like us to also delete all your service instances for you? And then it's not such a manual process, but do encourage everybody to clean up their content. I've spoken to some customers, and maybe they have a large team of developers, 30, 50 developers, and they're all creating container instances. And although they don't take up a lot of space in the database, if you don't load a lot of data into them, it starts to really, I find it freaks admins out when they open the cockpit or something like that, and then see 400 container instances out there, or something like that, 400 schemas with these crazy names. So it's a good practice to get into cleaning things up. So at this point, we've really seen our project end to end. Though I say that this isn't the end of this video series, I have a couple of dedicated topics that I'd like to add in addition to this. But we've taken the process end to end, and I would say, at this point, I'm not going to do things more building on top of this project. I actually have a finished project with some other examples that I'm just going to bring up and do a couple of additional videos on. But I hope you've enjoyed this journey from empty project, basically no concepts about the development environment in HANA, and hopefully we've taken you along here where you feel comfortable with building end-to-end applications and you have an idea of how all the parts and pieces fit together in this environment.